Hello and welcome to this bonus edition of the China Global South podcast. I'm Eric Olander. Today we're going to be focusing on the situation between China, India, and the SCO summit that's coming up this week. We're going to give you a little bit of a preview, but I know a lot of you are going to be listening and watching to this after the summit takes place. But what we're going to talk about will be themes that will no doubt be durable over the next week or two. Nonetheless, let's start with India. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is off on his Northeast Asia tour. He embarked on Friday to Japan, where he's going to spend 2 days before arriving in the northeastern city of Tianjin to participate in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. That is going to be a very big deal, in part because all the expectations have it that he's going to have a sideline gathering with President Xi Jinping, and he may also meet with Vladimir Putin as well. But this week, we're going to talk about and get a perspective now on the U.S.-India relationship that is hanging over the China-India relationship. They're linked there. This was a very big week in U.S.-India relations. India's total tariff rate on Wednesday jumped from 25% to 50%, putting the Indians nearly on the same level as the 55% that Washington imposes on Chinese exports. Outside of China now, India has the highest tariff rate of any country in Asia, which is really quite remarkable. This is a very big economic relationship between the U.S. and India, $212 billion in two-way trade, $83 billion of goods and services sold by Indian firms to the United States. A lot of that is now subject to tariffs. Not all of it, but a lot of it. There are some carve-outs. But there are a number of issues that got us to where we are today. And it's a little bit perplexing for those of us in Asia to be watching what's happening in the U.S.-India relationship. But Donald Trump seems to have soured tremendously on the relationship with Narendra Modi that he once prized quite a bit. India's membership in the BRICS has been a sore point for Donald Trump. Trump also took umbrage over the fact that India publicly contradicted him in saying that, no, the Americans did not mediate a settlement in the Operation Sindoor conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. That really got under Donald Trump's skin. But now the main U.S. talking point about India is the purchase of Russian oil. This is a little bit perplexing given Donald Trump's near unbridled support of Vladimir Putin over the years and the invasion of Ukraine. The White House now says that it wants to use Indian oil purchases from Russia as a way to halt the fighting in Ukraine. Let's hear the logic now from U.S. Senior Trade Advisor Peter Navarro, who recently appeared on Fox News and laid out the logic in a discussion with host Marita Bartiromo.
I want to get your take on India, because the foreign minister has revealed that the trade negotiations with Washington are ongoing. Now, India keeps buying Russian oil. There are lines that New Delhi needs to defend, he claims. Indian goods facing an additional U.S. tariff of up to 50%. That will take effect this week. Some of the highest levies imposed by Washington, largely because of the increased purchases of Russian oil. Is that what this is about, Peter? What is your take on India, and why is it that India is supporting Russia in this way?
Well, first of all, Russia invaded Ukraine February 2022. Before that, India bought virtually no oil at all from Russia. After that, it's buying a ton of oil.
Wow. Because
the refiners in Russia have partnered with the refiners in India to do this scam. It's basically the Indians get discounted crude, and then they refine it and they sell it on world markets to Europe, Asia, and Africa. And then Russia uses that money to build more weapons to bomb Ukraine and kill people. And then the Europeans and the American taxpayers have to pony up more money to pay to protect Ukraine. That's insanity. That's absolute insanity. So no one should feel sorry for India when the United States wants them to stop buying Russia oil, when it's not to cool their homes or to drive their cars. It's just to make profits for big oil in India. And by the way,
responded forcefully to the U.S. attacks and says if it wants to continue to buy Russian oil, it'll do so. And if others don't want to buy refined oil products, then they don't have to. But External Affairs Minister S.J. Shankar said this week that at the end of the day, he's just baffled by what the U.S. is doing.
We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil, that is China. We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian LNG. I'm not sure, but I think that is the European Union. We are not the country which has the biggest trade surge with Russia after 2022. I think there are some countries to the south. We are a country where actually the Americans said for the last few years that we should do everything to stabilize the world energy markets, including buying oil from Russia. So quite honestly, we are very perplexed at the logic of the argument that you had referred to.
All of this leads us to where we are today between India and China. And again, I mentioned Narendra Modi is on his way to Beijing. He's likely going to be speaking with Xi Jinping. Last week, he met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And there seems to be an escalation in the rapprochement between India and China. Now, a lot of Indian affairs experts are going to warn and say, listen, don't attribute this kind of détente to what's happening with Trump because it's been happening for a long time, at least a year before. However, Chinese Ambassador Xu Feihong, he is very much taking advantage of the situation between the U.S. and Indians to justify why India and China should have a closer relationship.
The United States has long been benefited greatly from free trade, but now it is using tariffs as a bargaining chip to demand exorbitant prices from various countries. The United States has imposed tariffs of up to 50% on India and even threatened for more. China firmly opposes it. In the face of such acts, silence or compromise only emboldens the bully. China will firmly stand with India to uphold the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core.
And once again, just to bring everybody up to speed on the state of relations between India and China over the past 5 years, it was bad. I mean, it's been very, very bad. No journalists, no ambassadors, no direct flights. But about a year ago, both sides seemed to see there was an interest to de-escalate, that they simply could not maintain the troop presences that they had along their disputed border, and it was just getting too expensive and costly to do so. And since then, they have moved forward. But let's get a perspective now on all of this that's happening, from the U.S.-India relationship, also a preview to the SCO summit, and to a perspective on China-India affairs. And I'm thrilled to be joined on the show for the first time by Derek Grossman, who's a political science and international relations professor at the University of Southern California, and also founder of Pacific Solutions, a geopolitical consultancy focused on the Asia-Pacific region. Derek, thank you so much for staying up late to join us today on the show.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
It's great to speak with you, and you're the perfect person to help us understand. First, we'll talk about the U.S.-India relationship. Then I'd like to get your take on the summit and what your expectations are. We heard from Peter Navarro. We heard from S.J. Shankar. Lots of accusations and counter-accusations. Where are we today after the tariffs have gone into effect? And help us understand how you see the rationale for the U.S. approach to India now after decades of relationship building that now seems to have vaporized.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think you're right. We in the United States have engaged with India for the better part of the last, 25 to 30 years. And we have sought to improve our relationship with India. And I think we've been very successful in doing that. But over the course of the last few months, we in the United States have completely taken a wrecking ball to our relationship with India. And I mean, of course, you can point to the barrage of social media posts back in late July from President Trump that were very accusatory of India, right, as kind of like the moment in which everything collapsed. But I mean, really, there's been a buildup to it, to be honest, because when you go back to February, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the White House, right, and met with Trump, things looked really good. But then shortly thereafter, you had the tariffs in April, and then you also had in May the war between India and Pakistan. It was a short war; it was only a 4-day war. But India, as you pointed out, took umbrage at the idea that Trump implemented some sort of ceasefire. India's position is that it was Pakistan that threw in the towel, and it had nothing to do with U.S. mediation, right? And then you didn't mention this, but I don't think it was your fault or anything. It's just there's been a lot going on. In June, you also had the Pakistani Field Marshal Asim Munir visit the White House, meet with Trump behind closed doors for over 2 hours. They took no questions. There was no photo op. It was very mysterious. And Modi, I think, has taken Trump to task over that. And by the way, Asim Munir came to the United States again just a few weeks ago. It was for the Central Command's change in leadership. And so, one could argue that it was a normal invitation to a longstanding friend and partner of the United States to Pakistan. There were many other, chief of army staff types present, right? He didn't go to Washington again, right? But at the same time, the Indians have to be wondering and are wondering, why does the United States continue to engage Pakistan, our mortal enemy, and a country that harbors terrorists like this, right? When we're trying to have a better relationship with the United States, we can't really do so if the U.S. is going to hold on to this Cold War legacy partnership with Pakistan. And, on top of all that, there's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Trump is now trying to take Russia to task. And one of the methods by which to do that, not saying it's necessarily the best one, or the right one, but he is certainly informing India that, there will be repercussions, right? And the personal issues between Modi and Trump. Apparently, Modi has not picked up the phone on 4 separate occasions. Trump has tried to call in the last month or so. So nobody's picking up because Modi's angry at him. And Trump is saying, well, but you didn't nominate me for the Nobel Peace Prize. You should have. Pakistan did, right? And Modi is saying, I still don't understand why you're friends with Pakistan and why you're making such a big deal about our relationship with Russia. We've had this for a long time. So those are kind of the, in life, right? Multiple things can be true at the same time. And I think in this case, that's also true.
Now, when when you try to put your MAGA foreign policy hat on, if you can try to interpret all of these
I
things
don't have
through,
one, but
if
I'll
you
try
if
to.
you
Yeah.
try and kind of like this is the world we live in today is
Yeah, of course.
not traditional foreign policy and institutional foreign policy, but Donald Trump foreign policy. Is it just because Donald Trump was insulted and he was miffed and he has responded emotionally to some of these issues and therefore the tariffs went up? Or is there something deeper and more strategic that could be at play? India was supposed to be a cornerstone in the U.S. effort to counter China in the Asia-Pacific region. It's a member of the Quad Security Partnership. India was supposed to be also maybe some of the offshoring of Chinese manufacturing out of China and into other parts of Asia to be able to kind of decouple from China. That was always what we heard. Now it's all changed. In fact, Donald Trump is a little bit miffed at Apple that Apple's producing so much in India for export to the U.S. Is there something deeper and more strategic that we're missing, or is this really what you've talked about, these personal slights and these misunderstandings and the Nobel Peace Prize lack of a nomination?
Well, yeah. So I actually do think there's something much deeper going on here strategically. So when you look at the first Trump administration, Trump surrounded himself with basically old school Republicans who continued the American foreign policy as it had been since the end of World War II, right? To try to uphold a rules-based or liberal rules-based international order, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to have the United States as the dominant power or as the hegemon, if you want to be more negative about it, right? But to promote this rules-based or liberals rules-based order through the dominant power, through the sole remaining superpower after the end of the Cold War. So that was Trump's first term, right? And he didn't like the people around him because that's not really how, as a leader, he felt about the world. I think 2016, honestly, I think he was surprised that he won. And he kind of rushed to put together people, and most of whom he didn't know and didn't trust. And there were kind of the folks he brought in, they were recommended to him by some of the people he did trust, right? The second term, I think, is completely and utterly different. In this case, he was already president, right? He knows who not to pick. And now he has a better sense of who to pick, right? Those folks who are going to be loyalists to him, and not only loyalists to him, but also have a certain worldview that comports with his worldview. And I think what we're seeing now, frankly, is an imperial presidency. We are seeing a presidency in which the president believes in spheres of influence, believes that the United States has a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. This is Monroe Doctrine 2.0. I think we're going to see Roosevelt Corollary 2.0 pretty soon as well, coming out in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy.
What is the Roosevelt Corollary, that just so for people who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so first of all, the Monroe Doctrine back, in the early 19th century basically said that the United States and the United States alone would maintain a purview over what goes on in the Western Hemisphere, and therefore other countries, namely the Western powers at the time that were colonial and imperialist, could no longer play a role without the U.S. saying so. Right now, the problem with the Monroe Doctrine is that we couldn't really back it up at the time. We didn't have the military to back it up. But by the time Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in the early 1900s, right, you now have a stronger Navy. We have the Great White Fleet that we send around the world to basically show we have a big stick. This is big stick diplomacy, right? And so Roosevelt adds the Roosevelt Corollary saying, we will back it up, okay? So I think when the Trump administration and Trump himself talk about the Panama Canal, they talk about Greenland, they talk about Canada being the 51st state, even though President Trump hasn't said that recently with the new prime minister there. When they talk about changing the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, this stuff we can all kind of chuckle at and think it's not a big deal, but it actually is part and parcel of a strategy of having a sphere of influence that nobody else can access other than the United States. Even the El Salvador connection, sending, illegal immigrants or those that we believe are illegal immigrants down there, right? It's like, it's sort of a neo-colonial relationship that's going on, all right? And how does that relate to China and to India? Well, China and India are free to have their own spheres of influence insofar as it does not significantly impact U.S. interests, right? Notice I said U.S. interests, not necessarily U.S. values, because I don't think we're in that realm anymore. I think this is realpolitik to the nth degree. And what we're seeing is that Trump wants to have a reset with China. He wants to have a reset with Russia, not just because he thinks Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are strong men in the way that he wants to be, but also because he believes that they are entitled as imperial powers to have their respective spheres of influence. When it comes to India, I think he probably thinks that India should have its own sphere of influence in South Asia as well. So if India and China are getting along better, that's fine for them, so long as they don't go to war with each other and that impacts U.S. interests.
So
right?
basically,
it's very different.
Yeah, I mean, if what you're saying is true,
have I blown your mind yet? Because this is...
Yeah, I'm struggling with this because the United States is always, as far as in modern history, has seen itself as a Pacific power. And it seems like what you're saying is that the United States wants to potentially withdraw itself as a hegemonic power in the Western Pacific. It wants to relegate that to India or China or whoever. What I guess I am struggling with is because when we talk about realpolitik, below the president, from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, down, they've always framed China as the existential threat to the United States, the peer competitor. This is the rival that we've never had before. They will, if you hear Marco Rubio talk about it, he will say the Soviets were nothing compared to what the Chinese are because of the economic strength, the technical capacity, and whatnot. So that feels like strategic interest and realpolitik. And by pushing India even slightly closer to China seems to undermine that strategy. How do you reconcile, again, not you, but in the MAGA universe, how do they reconcile what's happening in terms of alienating India, pushing India closer to China at the same time competing against China as a U.S. peer competitor?
Yeah, I think the premise of your question is that the Trump administration still is it still believes that China is some sort of, existential threat or some sort of chief rival in the global order and in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm not sure about that anymore. I'm actually not, right? I think
what part of it are you not sure about?
Well, because when you look at, you mentioned Secretary Rubio, he very rarely now will talk about countering China. And in fact, Secretary Hegseth, when he went to Singapore during the Shangri-La dialogue back in May, gave a very hawkish speech on China. He doesn't really say that anymore. And in fact, recent reporting in the last few hours has shown that the Pentagon is trying to have its own reset with China. They want military-to-military communication back. I think it's because Trump is telling them, I don't want to rock the boat with China. Things are very different. And we also, when you look at the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Pentagon, right, they have essentially purged anyone who has a hawkish view of China over the last few months. There's very few hawks left. And who is left now is a handful of people who are, I would call, isolationist, but then most of the people left are prioritizers. Okay, these are the Bridge Colbys of the world. So the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. This is J.D. Vance, the Vice President. It's people like that. Now, I still believe that they view China as a threat, but only insofar as it directly impacts U.S. interests, right? This is not about like upholding alliances for the sake of upholding alliances. That was more of a Biden thing, a first Trump administration thing, and all the other presidents back to World War II, right? Now we're sort of in the mold of, does this directly impact our bottom line and America First agenda? Does it impact the American people? If it doesn't, then we may not be engaged in it. And that kind of puts even the prioritizers in a tough spot because, Bridge Colby wants to defend Taiwan. Right? Like he's written a whole book about Taiwan.
And Trump has been very articulate on saying, listen, Taiwan is ripping us off. Taiwan stole our semiconductor technology, and he put pretty heavy tariffs on Taiwan as well.
Well, but I think Trump would spin it as, if our semiconductor access is in jeopardy because China is invading Taiwan, that directly impacts the American people. Therefore, we need to support Taiwan, right? But see, here's where the trouble begins. The Philippines has a standoff with China over the second Thomas Shoal. I don't think the Trump administration has any interest whatsoever in helping in that particular scenario. Now, Philippine President Marcos was just at the White House as well. Pretty decent meeting, not great, right? But I think that unless it impacts our bottom line, and that's kind of a fuzzy thing, and that's up for the president to decide, you're going to see very little proactive activity and very little responsiveness, frankly, because the hawks are out. The liberal internationalists, if you will, are out. This is a brave new foreign policy that we've entered. Some would call it realist. I don't think it's realist because, if it were realist, you'd want to have India on your side and not cozying up with China because that's kind of offshore balancing against China. But that's not quite what it is, right? It's actually more of an imperial spheres of influence strategy than anything else.
Well, this is a perfect segue then into the summit that's going to take place in Tianjin 20 leaders from around the world, including Putin. Also, Iran is going to be there. Pakistan, Central Asian countries will be there. Interestingly, this year, the leaders from Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia will also be there. The SCO has been around since 2001, long time, hasn't really done very much. But if what you're saying is true, and it's an interesting thread to pull here, that the United States is pulling back from the governor of the international order, if you will. And remember, Rubio said during his Senate confirmation that the international rules-based order has not served the United States well. And the Chinese are using these fora like the SCO and BRICS and the GDI, GSI, GCI, all of these new architectures as a way to build up a parallel international governance order that excludes the West. If this is the case of what you're saying, then maybe the White House isn't really that concerned by what they're going to see in Tianjin this week. If they want to get together and talk, great. Doesn't have anything to do with us. Tell me what you think the observations from Washington are going to be about the summit.
I think what you just said is the case. I think they're going to look at it and say, oh, it's good that they're getting along, right? But you see, I think you and I both know that, if you're not at the dinner table, then you're on the menu, right? And that's what I'm concerned about, right? And there's been a lot of breathless analysis about China and India becoming the best of friends, right? Especially punctuated by this meeting coming up with Modi going to have a sideline with Xi and going to be in China first time in 7 years.
You're a skeptic on that. You've been a skeptic on that.
I'm very skeptical, right? I mean, it was just in 2020 that China invaded part of Indian-held territory, okay? And only in October did they resolve that dispute. Okay, and I put resolve in quotation marks really because it was China that eventually pulled back to status quo ante, pulled its forces back to status quo ante. Okay, but the border still remains fundamentally unresolved.
Yeah, the Chinese issued new border maps last year that have not changed since they pulled their troops back.
Yeah, so exactly.
To the Chinese, the lines are still firm.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that since 2020, and especially in the last couple of years, the amount of infrastructure development on both sides has dramatically increased. And it's highways, it's rail, it's roads, it's bridges, it's airports, it's heliports, okay, in order to project military power more quickly and to forward deploy it, right, on a more routine basis to the border, not if, but when the conflict resumes, okay, is the way I think about it. So I am much less optimistic about them resolving that dispute, but also just in terms of their overall relationship. I mean, yes, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also many, many deep differences, right? I mean, just the other day, China called out India over the one China principle that, because they wanted India in a full-throated way to say, that Taiwan is a part of China. And they claimed unilaterally that India did that. But then S. Jaishankar, the external affairs minister of India, said, actually, no, our position remains unchanged. What is their position? Well, they haven't said it in many, many years, right? But the implication is that our position is that we're going to stay quiet on it because we have stayed quiet on it for so many years. And that is exactly what China does not want. They want India to vocalize that Taiwan is part of China. So there's these types of things. There's the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is in very frail health at this point. Whenever he passes, there's going to be a huge crisis in terms of who his reincarnation is. He has decided not to point in the direction of where that reincarnation will be born purposefully so that China cannot kidnap that individual the way they did to the Panchen Lama many years ago. And they appointed their own Panchen Lama who was vetted by the Communist Party. So, the Chinese are still very upset that Dharamsala in India is where the Dalai Lama lives, is, basically given asylum, right? These things are not going to just end because of some meeting in Tianjin. And oh, by the way, the SCO is a multilateral meeting. everybody there is kind of expected to show up no matter which member country it's in. So you could also argue that Modi's going there and I think Modi would argue this, that he's going there in the capacity of, leading the Indian delegation to the SCO, not to meet with Xi Jinping necessarily. If it happens, then great. It's sort of a side thing.
Which we might.
And it would be a side thing.
I mean, that
right?
was, yeah, it would be a sideline. And that was the expectation when Modi last week met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at his residence in New Delhi. But just to pick up on your point, add to the skepticism, it's not by coincidence, in my view, that the day after Wang Yi left, the Indian military test-fired an Agni 5 ballistic missile that can go 5,000 kilometers in range. Who else are they going to hit 5,000 kilometers away? And I think that was meant to send a message to say, while we are having these productive talks with the Chinese, we want to remind you that we can still hit you if we need to. And it shows the different constituencies within the Indian body politic that Modi has to manage. And not everybody's necessarily on board with this détente the way that it's going. But when you we spoke with Sushant Singh, who is a Yale South Asia scholar, and one of the points that he brought up was that it just wasn't sustainable for the Chinese and the Indians to maintain the levels of troop presence that they had on the border. Economically, it was not feasible. Militarily, it drew away from Pakistan for the Indians and the South China Sea for the Chinese. Talk about the shared interest that they have in de-escalating. This is different than saying we're going to kiss and make up and everything's going to be fine. But toning things down does serve both interests, according to Singh. And I'd be interested to get your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think in theory that's right, but it's also a game of chicken and who's going to blink first, right? Who's going to de-escalate first? And I'm just not seeing that right now because the distrust there is so incredibly deep. In a perfect world, it would be great for both of them to say, you know what, let's just completely de-escalate together, right? But they also now have this infrastructure that they've built, and why not use it, just in case? But you're right. I mean, India does have to kind of split the difference between China and Pakistan, so that's going to be difficult for them. China does not want to focus on its western flank. It wants to focus on its eastern flank. That's where all the activity is, whether it's Taiwan or whether it's, South China Sea or East China Sea or even a Korea scenario. So I think you're right in theory, but also, it's just the everyday human, I guess, nature part of it, which is to not really trust people, kind of gets in the way. And so I don't really see that ending. Also, just a quick note on the Agni 5. I think we got to pump the brakes a little bit on that too, because when we do tests, right? When we do tests in the United States, when any country does tests, usually they're scheduled many months out, sometimes even a year out.
You're suggesting that they weren't linked to necessarily the Wang visit.
I don't know. But what I'm saying is they are highly sophisticated and they usually are scheduled very far in advance. So that one might have been, but also the timing coincidentally would also help India's case to say, look, we'll meet with you, but we'll also fire this missile in kind of this, like carrot and stick approach to dealing with you. And I think that helps India's case, but I'm not sure that it was pre-orchestrated that way.
Okay. Well, I'll put something else on the table, is that here in Southeast Asia, we're starting to see the presence of the Indian Navy and the Indian military a lot more. BrahMos missiles are now being sold to Vietnam and also to Indonesia. The deals haven't, I think, been 100% finalized, but they've been in motion for quite some time. Also, the Indian Navy did ports of call in Singapore and in the Philippines and joined the Philippines in joint maritime exercises, which certainly the Chinese would see as provocative, them coming up this far into the Pacific. What's your take on that?
Well, India for many years now has been looking to get more involved in Southeast Asia. I mean, you can go back, decades ago, and India was trying to promote this look east, quote unquote, policy. And then when Modi came into office the first time back in 2014, he said, well, it's no longer going to be look east, it's going to be act east, right? And so India since then has been trying to get more involved, namely to have friends, to deal with China potentially down the road. And especially if China's going to do something in South Asia, then maybe India could do something in Southeast Asia to distract and to kind of split China's attention, so to speak, right? That's why I think you see India selling BrahMos to the Philippines. Indonesia's interested. Vietnam is interested, right? There's also, of course, Indian state-run conglomerates, defense conglomerates that need to make money, right? So, I mean, there's definitely an economic component to it. Again, multiple things can be true at the same time. But, why sell to countries like the Philippines where, India knows that China's going to have a pretty nasty response? Well, because India is concerned about what China's doing in its own region, right? And so this is a way to kind of push back a little bit. And I think you're going to continue to see that. But if, if Modi has a good conversation with Xi and things continue to get better between India and China, you may see India begin to take its foot off a little bit of that approach, but it would have to see some reciprocation from China. So this gets back to my game of chicken. Who's doing this first, right? And it's the same thing in the U.S.-China relationship, to be honest, right? A lot of it is, you're deterring because you feel like there's no other really good option, right? If you're not deterring and you're trying to engage, then you have to trust to do that. And where there's no trust or very little trust, it's hard to promote that kind of activity within your own government, but also with your people. So, yeah.
Well, just to wrap up our discussion, we've covered a lot of ground. I want to just end on the summit again. Lots of leaders getting together, 20 countries. Is this a big deal, or is this more of the past with the SCO where lots of talk, very little that comes away in substance? But the timing of it all with what's going on with Trump and Modi and the Chinese and the Indians does seem to add some weight to it. But what are you expecting from it, or what should we expect?
Yeah, well, I think we need to clarify what we're talking about, because on September 3rd, China's got the Victory Day 80th anniversary parade. And so there will be, Kim Jong-un from North Korea, Vladimir Putin from Russia there. The Iranian president will be there as well, right? But then I believe the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, as you said, will also be in attendance. But then there's the SCO, which is a kind of a different group of countries, and it will include India, right? So China's about to have this flurry of diplomatic activity, and I think sort of broadly speaking, it serves as a direct contrast to what the United States has been doing, which is a lot of one-on-one, very little multilateral, if any, right? And also not really taking into account, the value of meeting with all of these different countries, to be honest, right? And China is saying, no, we're going to continue to do that. We see value in it, right? And we're also going to tie it to historical events that are of relevance to China, right? And promote China through it. And I think that is another way that China can undermine the United States diplomatically in this diplomatic competition that's been ongoing as part of the larger strategic or great power competition between the two countries.
Man, these are amazing times. The curse of living in interesting times. Here we are. Derek Grossman is a political science and international relations professor at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Derek, again, thank you for staying up for us. We really appreciate it, and all of your insights. And we'd love to follow up with you again. And I also want to recommend everybody to check out Derek's feed on X. He's posting great insights there all the time. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. Derek, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. My pleasure. Take care.
And we'll be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening and for watching.